Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. I should take that off, then I won't keep speaking. Our colleagues in gynecology are obviously very important parts of this equation, and it may be that in Southampton we've been very fortunate in that 2 of the last 3 deans of our medical school have both been obstetricians and gynecologists, so we've been fortunate in that regard. There is no doubt that there is an increasing interest among gynecologists, and that is a very important consideration in terms of the management of problem pregnancies, as well as setting the scene for normal pregnancies. But there is an important agenda to pursue that needs to develop going forwards. You ask a very interesting question about vomiting and particularly hyperemesis during pregnancy, and I don't have a clear answer to that. In some of the studies that have been performed, that has been taken into account and does not appear to play as a major factor, certainly in women who start pregnancy in a well-nourished state. And one of the important questions then is the relative importance of the nutritional state that women start a pregnancy compared to what happens to them once they become pregnant. And if a woman starts a pregnancy well, then they can buffer, they can cope with that. I am less clear about the implied question, and that if women who are either underweight at the start of pregnancy, or maybe more and equally important, overweight or obese at the start of pregnancy, have particular problems. We know that in any case, those women have more difficult pregnancies. They are at increased risk of poor quality pregnancies, fetal loss, and personal problems. I don't know whether or not hyperemesis adds to that risk or diminishes it. I can't answer that question, I'm afraid.
From Algeria. Professor Qosser. Vous pouvez parler.
Thank you for your conference. Okay. During pregnancy, insulin resistance is physiologic state. When the insulin resistance become deleterious to disease development, future development, and it is the conflict between insulin mothers and insulin fetal.
I'm sorry, I was listening. I didn't realize you were asking the question in English.
I
got it in French and I couldn't understand it at all.
Ah, d'accord. During pregnancy, insulin resistance is physiological state in mother. When the insulin resistance become deleterious to development, this is chronic diabetes, obesity, and is it conflict between insulin mother and insulin fetal. Insulin, voilà. Est-ce qu'il y a un conflit entre... voilà. Mais dès le départ, le problème, c'est l'insuline résistance. Elle est physiologique. À un certain moment, elle devient délétère. À quel niveau, à quel moment? Parce que la femme peut développer un diabète déjà, une hypertension. Et voilà.
Si vous pouvez, s'il vous plaît, reposer votre question en français, comme ça, pour bien saisir la question.
Voilà,
merci.
D'accord. Durant la grossesse, l'insulinorésistance est un état physiologique connu. Voilà. La question, c'est à quel niveau l'insulinorésistance chez la femme peut être délétère chez l'enfant in utero, et qu'il peut donc le programme fœtal peut être interféré avec cette insulinorésistance de la maman. Et en même temps, la maman, elle a son insuline et le fœtus produit son insuline. Est-ce qu'il y a un conflit entre les deux sur le plan physiologique? Merci. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I understand the question as being related to insulin and therefore glucose homeostasis in the mother, and maybe also aspects of lipid homeostasis, and glucose homeostasis in the fetus, because insulin doesn't go across the placenta, but it facilitates, it determines the extent to which glucose might or might not move to a greater or lesser extent across the placenta. My understanding is that these are graded responses and that there is an interaction between the mother and the fetus. One of the more important considerations is when that graded response becomes pathological at the upper end of insulin resistance, where you get babies who are too large. And we have insufficient clarity of understanding about where that normal variability ends and where the pathology starts, and insufficient understanding of how that relationship impacts upon the fetal size around that cutover point. It's a very important question. I don't think that we have an adequate answer to it at this stage, if I've understood your question correctly.
Dr. Jamil from Bangladesh.
Thank you, Professor Jackson, for your excellent presentation, as usual. I have two questions. One is, do you believe that this hypothesis, Barker hypothesis is already a proven concept, or we still need more evidence? And secondly, do you already have some policy changes in your country based on the findings of the Barker hypothesis and related findings? Thank you.
It matters less whether I believe that the hypothesis is proven as to whether or not it can usefully inform actions. And I think that the bottom line is that much of the Barker hypothesis is observational experimental epidemiology that offers an explanation about the way we see the biology of the world. There is a growing body of animal experimental evidence that provides us with mechanisms that can explain that. What we do not have is population or even individual level interventions that puts those two together and says, if we look at interventions to address these changes, do we get the outcomes that we expect? And that's, to me, the importance of the study in Mumbai, because it is the first study that I know of where foods of variable quality and composition are being used in anticipation of pregnancy to see whether or not they improve the quality of the pregnancy in the way one would have predicted. And so I think there is still a lot of work to be done, both observationally but also experimentally. The difficulty experimentally is that you need such complex or large studies to do that, that it is unlikely that we will ever be able to afford to carry out that work. And therefore, in a way, it moves on to the answer to your second question. Is this part of policy in the United Kingdom? No, government has just received a review of the literature to advise them that they ought to consider the policy implications. What are the policy implications going forward? I think the policy implications is to have a focus on young people, particularly young women, to know what they do and how that enables them to grow, and how their growth better enables them to carry successful pregnancies. And I think that that ought to be an integral part of improvement in service delivery rather than as an experiment in its own right.
Absolutely, and we will hear in the second session after the break what is going on in the region in terms of service delivery in the region, North Africa and in the MENA region. Professor Jackson, in the region we see more often big mothers and big babies. So how does it fit into this picture?
Thank you. Well, that question in a way relates to the question that was raised earlier, because the relationships that I showed you, which make for the simple development of a hypothesis, tended to be straight lines with high on the left and a low value on the right. But if you look closely at all of those lines, the last group in the population shows an increase. And it's quite clear that the more populations you collect, that linear relationship isn't a straight line. It is, if anything, a J-shaped relationship. And for some populations, it becomes an inverted J-shaped relationship. So if you take a synthesis of the